Hello again. Greg has asked me to do another video for you guys, so I thought today I would show you one of how to draw a realistic eye. So the easiest way to do this is to take a picture of someone in your family or yourself if you have a phone and print it off, which is what I did in this case. This is my son. This is his eye. I just used my iPhone and took a photo of his eye and then printed it off just at home. If it prints off in black and white, that's fine as well too. For this sake, this drawing is just going to be done in pencil. So just to give you an idea of the reference that I was drawing from, this is my son's eye, so that's why it looks the way that it looks. He's a 16-year-old boy, Canadian boy with a Scottish background. So that's what his eye kind of looks like. That's the shape of it there. So that's what I used in order to get this as my reference. So I want to show you quickly, you can draw any eye that you want to draw, or if you want to draw one that is specific to an individual, sometimes that's helpful to have a reference to look at. But I was going to show you just really quickly an easy way to draw an eye. So I'm just going to put this over top. So this is my paper, and the beauty about doing these types of drawings is I am just using a basic HB pencil. So it's an HB pencil. It could also be considered, sometimes depending on what country it's from, it could be just called an H pencil, HB, a 2 pencil. Sometimes it's similar to the F pencil in an art set. It's basically the standard pencil that they would use in school for like in grade school when you go to school. So that's what I'm using. I'm also just using, this is a dollar store sketchbook, and this as well is just a pad of paper from the dollar store as well. So nothing overly expensive, nothing that it would break the bank, and then just your standard white eraser, and that's the tools that we need for this particular lesson. So keeping it really simple. The one thing to know when drawing eyes is eyes that don't have that highlight, and that's this white area here, they tend to look dead. So it's the actual, photographers call them a catch light. Other people would call them a highlight. It's the idea of the light source that you have, it hitting the eye, and that's the shape that it makes. So if you draw an eye that doesn't have that in there, they have a tendency to look dead. They don't look alive. And that's one thing that helps. The other thing that helps is making sure that this part, which is your iris and your pupil, is round. Okay, now we don't see the whole thing in this particular eye. If your eye tends to be rounder, some eyes, you will actually get a chance to see the whole iris, and you'll have more of the whites of the eye showing around it. If your eyes tend to be slanted one way or another, then it might hide a bit more of the iris, and so therefore this does not look as round. But whenever I draw an eye, for argument's sake of just drawing an eye, I start with the iris, and I just hover. The idea is when you want to draw a circle, if you don't have an object that you can trace, for instance, this is my lens cap, I could trace this to make a circle. But if you want to draw a quick circle, you hover your paper or your pencil above your paper without putting a mark down, and you gradually lower your pencil until it starts to make a mark. And as you have that momentum, you generally can get something close to a circular shape. All I'm going to do is pick roughly some of those markings that I made that can help me make a pretty decent circle. Then I'm going to erase it. And again, the one trick whenever you're drawing something is to draw light until it's right, okay? The reason is you don't want to be erasing too much away from your paper, and you don't want to be pressing too hard that you actually put marks onto your paper, because that will affect the outcome and how you overall are drawing it. The one thing also to remember about drawing an eye is the iris is round, the pupil is round, and depending on if you're actually drawing from an example, this would change based on the direction of where the person's looking. Now my son looked directly at the back of my camera on my phone, and so his eye is looking straight on the camera, and therefore the pupil is directly in the center. So there's his pupil. And depending on how much light is hitting that eye will determine how big or small your pupil actually is. And that will determine how much of the iris is actually shown. So I'm just going to throw in a highlight that was similar to the window that we were looking at. Okay, so there it is. And I'm just going to erase whatever lines are inside that highlight, because I want my highlight to stay the white of my paper. Now the next thing you want to do, depending on what eye you're drawing and basically what their background is like, will determine what their eye looks like. Some people have, and depending on their age too, some people have a hooded eyelid, which means that you have less of the iris showing and not a whole lot of eyelid either. So my son kind of has these almond-shaped eyes. And the other part that you want to remember is sometimes when people draw an eye, they basically will draw it completely symmetrical, and our eyes aren't like that. You know, we have the tear duct that's somewhere in here, and sometimes our eyes, this end of our eye is a little bit higher or lower from the tear duct. So you don't want to draw like that because they're not completely symmetrical. And then they also have that area of the pink flesh, depending on the eye that you're drawing and the shape of it. It has that sort of shape towards the end, our tear duct being in this general area. So you can see that they're not symmetrical at all. And again, I'm just drawing lightly, okay? And you can see that I've allowed the iris to extend outside of his eyelids because that's how his eyes are. He doesn't have round eyes. They are more of an almond shape, okay? Then we have, you'll have to forgive me, I don't know the pink, is it a carnuncle or something like that? This part in here, those of you that are studying biology, you can correct me and tell me what the proper pronunciation is of that, but you'll have that fleshy area in there. So some people's eyelids come right down and you don't have too much space in between here, especially if you're older. If you're older, your eyelids will tend to sag. So, but if you're drawing somebody who's you know, below 30, let's say, their eyelid probably is not that droopy. And eyelids tend to follow the shape of the eye too. Okay, I'm just drawing this in lightly so I have an idea of where to place everything. And then you also have the bottom. Now this is where people tend to make their error when they're drawing eyes. They tend to outline everything really, really dark. And then when they go to shade in, it looks artificial. It doesn't look fake. What I tell people when they're learning to shade things in is that the shading is what determines the outlines. So if you'll notice on this eye, we've shaded everything, but there are some areas where there is no shade. Down here, for instance, because he's so pale, we don't really see a lot of detail there. And even though it's not a complete full line here, we understand it to be so. I did not outline the eye. I did all shading to determine the differentiation between his iris and the white part of his eye. So hopefully that makes sense. You're not going to be leaving or drawing in a hard line for this eyelid. You're going to allow your shading to determine where the edges are. Okay, so usually what I do is when I have the shape that I like, I erase a little bit of my lines so they're not going to be standing out outside of the shaded area. Now, the easiest way to shade an eye is to do it in layers and in stages. So I'm going to show you really quickly. I am not pressing hard. I am shading all in one direction. And and this is a cheaper paper, so it tends to not be able to handle layers very well. It will, if you press too hard as you're shading, eventually what you're going to get is a shine, and that shine basically means that you've bruised your paper, you've ruined your paper, and you don't want that shine to be there. If you notice when sometimes when people draw, they'll have a tendency, okay, so they'll have a tendency to draw something. Let's say again, it's the eye, and they press hard, and then when they shade it in, they press really, 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 really hard, okay? Just because they want it to get dark, 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 like the actual iris. What I've done, and I can actually feel myself doing it, is I have pushed so hard that I've dented the paper, and now I've ruined the surface, the paper surface. I don't know if it's picking up, but there's an actual shine to this. When you draw on paper, unless it's a very, very fine computer paper, a very smooth computer paper, paper has little divots. It has these bumps in it that kind of weave up and down, and it kind of looks like an uneven surface. When you press really, really hard, you're actually squishing all those bumps down, and that's what causes that shine. They say that you have destroyed your paper. So sometimes if you are coloring really, really hard and pressing really, really hard, you press so hard that you can put a hole right down through your paper. That's basically what's happened. You've destroyed your paper. So to get the iris and the pupil part to be dark, you just keep layering. So it's just going over top in the same direction over and over and over again, but you are not pressing hard. You're pressing with the same pressure, the same amount of pressure that you did the initial time. Now, if you're drawing on good paper, you will be able to get it quite nice and dark. You will actually be able to pick up some of the texture from the paper, and it's quite beautiful. But if you don't have that, then this is the technique how you would learn to draw using whatever you have available. So cheap paper, cheap pencil. Sometimes artists will use a pencil that has a different number. So instead of an HB, it would be maybe a 6B, which means it has the opportunity and the potential to go blacker, to go darker. It's a softer pencil, and therefore you're able to get more graphite on your paper, and that's essentially what's happening. We don't have that option. We have just what we have here, which is our standard HB. So everything has to be done with layering. I'm going to show you a quick way to shade in this eye. And if you'll notice, on my son's eye, originally, he's got a couple of different tones in here, okay? We're not worried about the fact that part of his eye is brown and part of his eye is blue. We're going to worry about the lights and the darks of his eye. So here, his eyelid is creating a little bit of a shadow on his eye. Then he has his medium tones, and then he has his light areas right in here. And that's what we're going to draw when we do our shading. So basically, I'm going to shade everything in very, very lightly. Okay, and I'm going to do this quickly just to show you. And what I like to do is, because if you look at eyes, they have actually, I call them spokes or scales. They have this texture in them that is quite spectacular. And it all comes out from the center. They all come out almost like spokes on a bicycle. So I like to shade in that direction when I'm trying to get all the texture. And you can see I am shading very, very, very lightly, okay? Now, I would continue doing that, layering upon layering upon layering, and the areas that I want darker, I am going to shade darker and darker and darker. Now I'm going to stop this video here so it doesn't get too long, and we're going to pick it up so that we're going to have a 1-part and a 2-part so that you will be able to see in more detail how I add some of this highlights and the lowlights and the shadows and everything, all that detail, how I add that into his eye. So I'm going to stop this now, and then in a couple of days, Greg will post the 2nd part to this video. And what you'll find is that I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer so you can actually watch my hand and see how it is that I'm putting some of those details in for the shading of the eye.